Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 98 of the podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in today's interview, I talk with four people, so this is probably the largest interview I've ever done. But we talk with four of the five authors of the book, 4 Views on Pastoring LGBTQ Teenagers, Effective Ministry to Gay, Bi, Trans, Queer, and Questioning Students Among Us. Many of you are familiar. If you serve in student ministry, you probably know Mark Oestreicher. Marco, he's the editor of the book. He's on the podcast interview, but we got 3 of the 4 contributing authors in this conversation. And whether you serve in children's ministry or student ministry, I think you're going to want to listen to this because personally, I don't feel like there's enough good, healthy conversations about this in ministry world. There certainly aren't enough good resources out there, and this book is a great resource for especially those who serve in middle school, high school ministry, but really for anyone, because a lot of the things that we talk about in the interview and even in that's discussed in the book, churches overall need to have good conversations about this. So I appreciated when I read the book, there are differing views. That doesn't come out a ton in there. Marco tries to push into it at one point, which is really good. But even the authors don't agree. So if you're sitting here thinking, where's this going to go? I'm probably going to disagree with it one way or the other. You know, I'm on this side theologically or that side, or maybe you don't even think of it as sides. I hope, this is my hope for all of us, and not even just this topic. I hope we can always be the kind of leaders who will learn from anyone. I hope we'll be the kind of leaders who listen to anyone. I think the discourse needs to happen, and we need to be okay understanding that everybody doesn't believe what we believe, and we need to be able to learn from each other. I feel like learning from someone who disagrees with me theologically only helps my own view if I'm really open, if I really listen, because in the end, I'm either going to learn that maybe I agree with them and maybe I don't know as much about my position as I should, or it's going to help me realize the position that I have even more, the depths of it, why I believe what I believe. But some of that, I mean, that's not really the focus of the book. It's not a theological position on this. It is really about pastoring LGBTQ teenagers. And what does that look like on the ground in the moment when, a student tells you something, and theology is not the first thing you're coming with, at least I hope not. So regardless of what you might believe about the topic theologically, I think you'll find this interview to be helpful and practical, and we just need more, good conversations about it, like I said. So I hope you'll find it to be helpful. It is 4 people plus me, so I think they did a great job kind of, saying who was talking each time we bounced around. Sorry that my voice isn't great now, but it's even worse in the recording because we recorded that earlier. Just been getting over a cold here, but I'm not the one you want to hear anyway. You want to hear them. So let's go ahead now and jump into my interview with 4 of the 5 authors of that book, and I think it's going to be really helpful. So let's listen. All right. Well, today I'm joined by 4 guests as we talk about a book they all helped write entitled 4 Views on Pastoring LGBTQ Teenagers, Effective Ministry to Gay, Bi, Trans, Queer, and Questioning Students Among Us. So welcome, everybody. I don't know what order we need to go in, but how about you all introduce yourself one at a time, tell us a little bit about you, and maybe, tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write, part of this book. That'd be helpful.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Nick. I can jump in. My name is also Nick. I'm Nick Elio. I'm a family ministries pastor at Denver Community Church in Denver, Colorado. And was super excited when the Youth Cartel and Marco reached out about the book. Our faith community had just come out for full inclusion for the LGBT community a few months before I had originally talked with Marco about the book, and we've been living in that way of inclusion previous to that. And so it was cool timing to be able to weigh in on some of the things that are happening in the church right now.
Cool. Thank you.
And I'm Eric Woods. I serve as the pastor to residents and staff at a center that does residential treatment for youth in crisis and in a biblical Christian kind of context called Eagle Village. And so I work with young people ages about age 8 to 18 from a variety of backgrounds. Most of them have experienced trauma, abuse, and neglect in their backgrounds. And so we have the opportunity to minister to lots of kids who are struggling with their sexuality and understanding their own gender and where they fit in the church in those contexts. And so really, had the opportunity to speak from that perspective as we dove into this project. And it's been great as it has opened my eyes really to see some of those young people more clearly and fully and maybe differently than I would have before I began to think deeply about this topic.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
And my name's Shelley Donaldson. I'm currently in transition with my job, so I am about to step into an associate pastor for youth and mission engagement role with a new church in a few weeks. And so I'm in the midst of that transition, but I was super interested in writing this book when Marco first asked, because as an out lesbian working with youth and their families, I get a lot of questions from other youth workers, and most people just don't know where to start. And so this was a great way to put some pedagogical things out there and for people to easily access, and to also remember that we're all coming at this from different perspectives. And that's really important that we're hearing each other's perspectives as youth workers and as writers. And we need those voices to be accessible to so many of the youth workers and youth volunteers and youth pastors who are out there that are needing some sort of either guidance or just are curious about the topic.
My name's Mark Oestreicher. People call me Marco. And I'm a partner in the Youth Cartel, and we do a bunch of things, but one of the things that we do is we publish books for youth workers. And I'll dive right into the question of why we developed this book, how it came to be. We decided maybe 2 years ago that it would be fun to consider some Four Views books that other than Four Views on Youth Ministry, which is a book that when I worked at Youth Specialties, we developed years ago. It's kind of an academic title. That most Four Views series are really a theological debate. Zondervan has a famous line of those that are a wide variety of different theological areas with theologians debating. We decided that instead what would really be useful would be a line of books that were a pragmatic dialogue over areas where there would be either confusion or questions or differing approaches. And so we knew that this question of pastoring LGBTQ teenagers really needed to be the first book out of the gate. We've got 2 more in development right now, 4 views on talking to teenagers about sex and 4 views on youth ministry short-term missions. So that's kind of the vibe of the book. Choosing the 4 contributors was a huge challenge, way bigger than I thought it was going to be. It took us well over a year just to land on 4 contributors, just because getting these, obviously, the 4 best possible people took us lots of fits and starts. And part of our commitment was we wanted people who were not just theoreticians or had an opinion, but that were actual in the trenches youth workers who had experience of working with LGBTQ teenagers and would write out of that place of experience. And then also that had differing perspectives from one another. So, yeah, we have 3 of those on our call today. The 4th, Gemma, lives in the UK, and she was a wonderful contributor too. So that's kind of how the book came to be. Yep.
That's great. I think my favorite thing, I didn't know this before I read the book, was the differing views. So I love that there's one of you writes about your thoughts on this, and then one of you responds and maybe has a different perspective. We need more of that in the church, I think. So, Marco, you said in the book that you get 2 questions all the time, which are the same 2 questions I hear a lot of too, which is one of those questions is, I recently had one of my youth group kids come out to me. What should I do? I think that'd be a great thing to talk about here, and anybody can weigh in on that. That is kind of that practical help that leaders, I think, need? And even beyond that, how can leaders train their teams to be able to lead well in those situations? So what would you say to that? Anybody who wants to jump in and talk about that?
Yeah, this is Nick Elio from Denver. So I want to start with the big one. What should I do with LGBTQ teenagers? Yeah, I think that certainly is probably a really great starting point and a question that we all get a lot, whether people know that we, have had some length of time in student ministry or know some of our context in regard to that. I start from a place of just recognizing that you're dealing with people, you're dealing with friends and brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And as soon as you get to that place where the conversation switches from, hey, what should I do with a particular person? You're not having a theoretical conversation anymore. You're not able to just throw around nice theological ideas about, what you should do. That's not going to help you. You need to figure out what you're going to do with a real life person. And if that answer is not rooted in some sort of relational, compassionate, loving, conversation with them to move them forward, regardless of your theological position, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss the point. And the reality of the number of LGBT teenagers that experience anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, homelessness, disconnection from their families, those numbers are through the roof. And so if the church isn't a safe place for kids to begin to even just have those conversations and for it to feel supported and loved by us, again, regardless of maybe where we are on that theological spectrum, we're not doing our job. So.
Yeah, I have sort of a short list that I give folks because I get this question so often. I have for years. There's this sort of general consensus in the population that if you're part of the LGBTQ community, you know the answer to this. And I did not know the answer to this question for a really long time. And so what I have tried to work with youth workers, especially in the Presbyterian church, as we wrestle with this, is first off to tell these youth workers, number one, you're the first resource, because that's what they all want. They all want a resource. What do I do? What can I give them? And the first thing I say is you're the first resource. You're where the buck stops. And your job is to remind them that they're loved by God, that you still love them, and that you're there for them. And that to me is sort of like, that's one of the biggest assurances you can remind them of, is that like, you're still loved by God. That does not change. And even as youth workers, that can be a paralyzing thing to think, oh, that's right. No, we should do that. But when you're in the moment, it's hard to think of that. The second thing I tell folks to do is to be honest about where you're at, whether or not you know terminology, which I'm always learning, or, whether or not you're up to date on some of the social issues going on, to be really honest about, look, here's where I am. I either know about these things or I don't. And to say that I will work with you however, and we'll figure this out together. And then the third thing to do is to put it back on them and say, what can I do for you? What do you need? And so you're sort of you're going into this covenantal relationship and saying, I'm going to walk with you through this. You are enough. Now, what do you want? What do you need from me? And giving them an opportunity to have a say in what it is that they feel they need, where they feel maybe God is calling them to. Maybe they have no idea, but it's a way to sort of hand them over a little bit of power in a situation where they often feel so powerless when a youth comes to you and says, I have to do X, I have to tell X, Y, and Z, or I feel like I might be transgender, but I don't know. So for me, those are the first things I tell people is follow those couple of steps, and you've already set yourself up to be in a safe, healthy relationship, and to give yourself some grace to learn some new things.
This is Marco. Nick, I two ways I would respond to that question. One is not a direct answer, but I think that the question points to a broader issue that became really clear to me as we were developing the book. It was kind of a fuzzy understanding of mine from my own story. I have a genderqueer child, my oldest, 24 years old. And so this is something that my wife and I have walked through quite a bit. And as youth workers started finding out about that, that's why I started getting these questions. But as we developed the book, it became more and more clear to me, and this is something I bring out in the intro, that it is just impossible. And I would almost say it's not only impossible, that it's just misguided to try to develop your practice or your theology of how you'd respond to LGBTQ teenagers outside of the context of relationship. That as soon as you have a relationship with someone that you care about, whether that's a family member or a teenager in your youth group or somebody that your heart is moved toward, who is wrestling with these questions, the issues become very different and are simple, often simplified or simplistic theological positions are often not enough anymore, and we need more. We need something deeper. So that's definitely a bit of a context for everything in the book. I'll also say that since we published this book in early January, this very question that you're asking has been ramped up. Like, I was getting this question 2 or 3 times a month, but now I'm getting it 2 or 3 times a week, it feels like. And what I've learned from my own experience, but also from the other contributors, is the first response. This has been a very helpful learning for me. The first response needs to be to affirm the courage of that teenager in talking to you. It is, for almost all of them, it is a gutsy, courageous move to initiate this conversation with a youth worker. They're unclear about whether or not you can be trusted on this, even if they have a good relationship of trust with you. So to first say, thank you for your courage. I know it took courage. And look at this, that response can be true no matter what your theological position is on these issues, right? So to affirm their courage first and foremost, to empower them in that way is a really helpful first step, and something that we can train our volunteers to do. And then I would follow that with these statements that Shelley just brought up, which came out in all of the contributors' chapters. They developed their chapters independent of one another and hadn't seen each other's writing, so it was interesting to see the commonalities. And all of them said, we have to say first, you're loved, God loves you, we love you, and I would add to that, and we want you here. There's always going to be that question of, do you still want me, or is this going to lead to rejection? And so to clarify, thank you for your courage, and then follow that with, you're loved by Jesus, we love you, and we want you here. Everything else has to fall under that banner, and those statements, I think, need to be restated over and over again, because just stating them once will not often completely put away the concern or expectation of rejection or condemnation.
You know, I think for me, this is Eric, one of the things that I've realized is that a lot of the youth workers in my circles had approached this as a theoretical question, like, well, what would I do if this were to happen? And I think what they're realizing, and as I've had more conversations, just like Marco has had around this, than I had ever dreamed I would have in my lifetime over the past couple of months, I'm finding out that most of them are starting to realize that there are young people in their ministries and in their churches and in their communities for which this is a current and active struggle for them, where they're trying to figure out, who can I talk to about this? Who's going to support me? Who's going to help me to work through this? Who can I trust? All those questions that Marco raised. And I think people are realizing that this is not just a theoretical question for them, but this is a reality of their ministries. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it's not just, youth workers, working with teenagers who need to have an understanding of how they would respond. I mean, I'm parents, elementary school teachers and school principals who are coming to me and talking about these questions and asking the question, how do they respond? And so I think, we can take the position of a leadership role in this context and be able to sort of help those others in those other contexts that aren't what we would consider traditional ministry contexts know how to respond as well. Parents, families, and then people and others in our communities as well.
That's good. That's really helpful. I think that's the kind of practical stuff that leaders and volunteers need, because it's not like the first conversation, the first time you encounter that, it's the hardest. You're just not ready for it. So those are some really good practical tips. When I read the book, there are a lot of things that stood out. Nick, one of the things you wrote that I thought was interesting was that your church has moved towards a full inclusion stance, but I thought you were kind of saying that all your elders may not agree theologically on it, right, which I think most churches probably feel like it's got to be. Like, right, whatever our stance is, it has to be 100% somewhere, staff, elders, whatever it might be. So I thought that was interesting. Can you explain that a little bit and share what that looks like?
Yeah, it was an interesting deal. And I think, one of the things I did say in the book was, if there's a story to come out of DCC, it's easy to talk about the inclusion piece, but to your point, there is something about going like, whoa, you're saying that men and women on leadership, on your elder board, are not necessarily in agreement on this and are still somehow moving forward. Like that is a pretty rare thing. And I think some of what had happened was there's this idea of, more and more the church is getting known for its division. We're getting known for all the ways that we disagree with each other instead of the things that we're supposed to be known for. And so in the middle of this, I think the heart of our leadership was going, how do we move past that? How do we create a better narrative around what this looks like? And even in a bit of a joking way, people would ask, like, hey, what does DCC think about this LGBTQ conversation? And in the sense of acknowledging that DCC is a community of people and not any one particular person, the answer would be like, well, I can't tell you what any certain number of people think about that. What was leadership think? Well, leadership's 30 people that all have different experiences and backgrounds and family members and theological leaning. So to answer that as this is DCC's position felt short-sighted in some ways. And then there's, major on the majors, minor on the minors. Like, as we're all trying to figure out how to follow Jesus and love others well and invite more and more people into that. Did we really feel like this needed to be something that we split our church over or something like that? Because plenty of communities have done that, unfortunately. And so it really is a remarkable group of men and women on our elder board that decided, hey, though we may disagree on the theological implications, I should say, what they did not disagree on was that we should move forward in full inclusion. So they disagree, potentially around the what actually the text might say and mean for our current day, but they don't disagree on we should move forward. And so to this day, over a year later, we've not had anybody on staff, and we've not had anybody in a leadership position. We've not had an elder leave our team over this issue. So it's really, really remarkable.
Hey, Nick, I thought it was really interesting how you brought out that important for you in that was the voices of some LGBT people who came to you and lobbied for that. Maybe you could bring that out.
Yeah, that is a really cool piece, Marco, is that as our elder board sort of decided what to do, Nick, there was like this sense of there was almost like these two ways to go about it that we've seen, right? Churches and elder boards and leadership or denominations go, hey, we're going to be open and affirming and sort of move that direction, or we're going to stay the course in this maybe more traditional understanding of where the church has landed in this regard. And that feels obviously very binary. And it's this either or place where you feel a little stuck. And some folks in the LGBT community spoke to us as we did this, because it was not a short process. 2 years of our elders thinking and praying and investigating and talking to people, talking to side A folks and side B folks. And one of the things that came up, to Marco's point, was this idea that LGBTQ people didn't want us to go, didn't want us to go full to open and affirming, because that doesn't necessarily move the ball forward. It actually just swings the pendulum the other direction. So if we're living in a world where the position is, I can't be a part of this community because I disagree, you can be in that place if you're an affirming person and a church is not affirming, but that can also happen on the other side where you're not affirming, and so they didn't want people who disagree with their position to feel unwelcome in the church, which is incredible. LGBTQ people don't want people who disagree with them to not feel like they can be a part of a faith community, which on some level, right, on just this pure sort of tit for tat level, you could be like, that's what people have made you feel, and it would almost be understandable for them to want to swing the pendulum the other way and go, well, now it's our time to be involved in something. And they don't want that. And so we have a group of, the people at our church. You may be sitting next to somebody who is in a gay relationship, and you don't disagree with it, but it goes both ways, right? You're also if you're part of the LGBTQ community, you're being asked to sit next to somebody who may disagree with your relationship or may not understand what's happening. And so it creates a really colorful expression of the body for sure.
One of the questions, Shelley, you posed this in the book, and I want to ask this now of all of you, and maybe start a little debate here, maybe, because it's obvious from the book that you have different perspectives and different beliefs and things like that. You ask, can a church be truly welcoming without a theology change? Which is a good question, because a lot of churches want to say, yes, everybody's welcome, but we might disagree, kind of to your point, Nick. So I would love to hear from all of you. What do you think about that? Can a church really say they're welcoming if ultimately, theologically, they disagree about something like this?
Shelley,
go first.
They're making you go first. You don't have to. But somebody's
That's fine. No, I asked the question, and I think so. Nick makes a really great point. So there is a contingency of the LGBTQ community that says we don't want other people to feel unwelcome because we know what it's like to feel unwelcome. I personally know what it feels like to have a pastor physically spit on my face because I'm an open lesbian and because I'm married. And so that stuff hurts. Like, it is real. It's visceral. But if you really claim to believe in that saving grace and that holistic love of God, that unconditional love, then you don't want others to feel as you have felt. But everybody is on a different path. Everybody is in a different place. And so that is a hard question to answer. What I love about Nick's church and what they're doing is that they have said, this is where we're at. Here's where we're going to go. They've been thoughtful about it. They've been courageous about it, and they're moving forward. And the reality is that everybody is going to be at a different place at different times, depending on your community, depending on those differing theologies. I think for me, it's really important when looking at those theology that a church is claiming to hold, is to realize that, yeah, people are different. But the question is, are you actually working towards a theology that is cohesive? It's a little bit of a muddy place for me as a Presbyterian, because we really love to hold the tension and say that everybody can have different points of view. And I do think that's really important. I think the question for me of, can you hold differing theologies and be a church is a hard one, because I think there are some things you have to agree on. We agree that Christ is the Son of God. Christ died, Christ rose again, Christ was resurrected, and in that we have eternal life. There are things that you've got to believe in, but everybody's got differing views. And so I think that to sort of not answer your question and answer your question at the same time, and say that I think there are some things you've got to be the same on, but at the same time, you can't always have the same theology. So maybe it's a better question posed of, is it possible for everyone to have that same theology? Because as an LGBTQ person, I need people to get on board, because there's only so many times I can have the conversation of telling my personal story until I'm like, seriously, people, just deal with it so that I can do my job, so that I can just go over here and be a youth pastor and let me do my job. But at the same time, everyone has different responsibilities in the church. And part of my responsibility, I feel, part of my call is to have those conversations with people, and they're hard and they're messy, and they can be really not fun, but they can also be really fruitful and really productive and really beautiful at the end of the day. So I think that that you can have a church that has differing theologies, but I'm not sure what, if we can say that all of those differing theologies on different topics can be different.
I think one of the things that I've realized, this is Eric again, in this process is that, this idea that we can, and one of the things I was challenged on, I think, in the response to my chapter was this idea that, I can hold a theology that says, X about, all of the things associated with gender and sexuality, and say I'm welcoming, but it may still not be perceived as welcoming. Even I could say it all day long till I'm blue in the face, and there are going to be people who say, yeah, but your theology makes it necessarily an unwelcoming place for me. And so I think for me, that just has given me all the more reason to go out of my way to be intentionally engaging with people with whom my theology is different, and to say, how can I, go out of my way to help them feel like they belong in the church first and foremost, and maybe they also belong in my church and my ministry, and that they can feel that that's a safe and welcoming place for them, even when there is disagreement. And I think there's going to be people who aren't going to feel that. And so I'm not going to necessarily change my theology in this area. And that's probably going to make it not a safe place for some people, but I'm going to fight from a practical standpoint to make it that as much as I can.
I think if I were listening to this podcast right now and had not read the book, I might wrongly conclude that we're just one little happy band of people who agree on everything. And the reality is there are some very sharp disagreements amongst this group. That is part of what makes it a productive dialogue. And I'm thinking at this moment of Shelley's response to Nick's chapter, which is really specifically about this question. And I'm going to paraphrase you, Shelley, but in my memory of it, you affirm Nick's church's desire to create a bigger table and welcome more people to the table, but then say something like, but at the end of the day, it's a little hard to sit at the table if you know there are people at the table who think that you are sinful or wrong, and that just creating a bigger table is not enough. That's your argument. Yes, and that still is my argument. I think that, and again, I come from a particular position of being someone who's part of that LGBTQ community, and knowing or believing that it's disingenuous when I am sitting at the table with someone who thinks that I am less than, because I know that I am not, that I am created and loved by God, and I am just as good as anybody else, and I am just as sinful as anybody else. And so for me, I do affirm the Nick's community's work. And then I want to push communities to say, you have to go further. Just by opening the table, that's a great thing to do. That's a step. But the next step has really got to be that intentional dialogue and conversation of moving forward together. To sit at table with someone who is unwilling to meet me in the middle, that's not an equal relationship. And so I do think that while we may not agree, we've got to work to agree. So we've got to make the table bigger, but we've also got to put the dialogue on the table and start moving the conversation forward so that we're seeing each other as full humanity. We're not just seeing me as, the lesbian sitting over at the table who maybe can reach certain kids, but as another human of God that's equal to somebody who may or may not agree with who I am. Because the reality is that we have kids that are seeing things in the media, and they're seeing that they are less than. They're seeing a society that is really built around a heteronormative world. And so for them, they see that, and they see where they don't fit in. They see where they are less than what is the popular culture, what is considered the quote norm.
And so that's part of what we have to challenge, is that norm, and saying, are these things really the norm? Can we start to have a bigger conversation and maybe broaden that term so that we're all on equal footing? But I also think it's really important that I can't force someone to see me as a child of God, as an equal to them. And so part of that is work that I have to do on my part to reach out to them, but work on their part that they have to do as well to try to find that middle ground with me. And so it's a really hard conversation to have. But yeah, again, the table is set, the table is ready. What are we going to do at the table, and how are we going to do it so that there is full inclusion for everyone?
Yeah, and I should say too, I so appreciate Shelley's perspective, and it's funny, as much as like there's this thing where maybe it's like, there's this bit of a disagreement between us as individuals, or between, the way our community is moving forward, like just by the virtue of going towards full inclusion for the LGBT community, to say that we didn't have anybody on leadership leave over this choice we've made isn't to say that we didn't have anybody leave, because there were certainly folks that decided they weren't going to move forward with us in that. And so I think by virtue of sort of the position we've taken, in order to sit at that table, right, wrong, or indifferent, there aren't a whole lot of people who want to sit at that table with their arms crossed, viewing someone like Shelley as someone who's not equal, or not, who doesn't deserve to be there. It's sort of this, it's almost like this cause and effect, or we haven't said, we don't want anybody to not feel welcome, but by the virtue of who we are going to welcome, that makes some people go, well, then I can't be a part of this. It's almost like the older brother, but sorry, prodigal son, reference.
Nick Blevins, not to take over for you, but I also am wondering here if it might be helpful to hear a little more from Eric, because his view on this in the chapter he wrote is probably more different than Shelley and Nick's, and might be more similar to a lot of your listeners. So
I got that. I got that sense too. Reading, I guess it was your response, or maybe it was your next chapter.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot there, Marco. So this is a struggle for me, and I think for a lot of people, because I think Shelley and I, we've never met in person. We don't know each other, and so we talk through the computer and through this book, but I think there's this sense that, for me, the struggle, because I genuinely want people in the LGBTQ community to feel, welcome in the church and welcome to be full participants in our ministry. Now, what that means, what that looks like, what my theology says about that, there's disagreements on. And so for me, I feel when I hear these things, and this is a struggle for, I think, a lot of people to say, well, can I keep my theology, and is there any way then to be in community or in relationship with people who disagree theologically? I think probably around this group of 5 people in this conversation, we have differing theology about baptism. We may have differing theology in other areas as well, and yet I don't know that we're saying that because Nick, Elio, and I have different view on the mode of baptism, and we might not, that we couldn't.
We do. It's very different.
That I think of him as less, and so, but the struggle for me is then, how do I communicate to Shelley that I don't think of her as less, that I am excited by the ministry that she has, the way that God is using her, and yet we differ theologically. Now, from a practical standpoint, there's a lot of things probably that she and I are doing in ministry that look a lot alike, and I think that's the surprise that people have found as they've read this book. They went, wait, these people are, one way over here and one kind of, further over this direction, and they're doing a lot of the same sorts of things to reach the same sorts of people, and so that's where I'm at, and I also have seen in with Gemma, who's not here to share, her experience of a personal relationship of a family member. I mean, that really shaped her own, I think, theological convictions and forced her to reconsider those. And I think all of us, when we engage in those close personal interactions with people in the LGBTQ community, that does force us to reconsider, what do I believe and why? And I think those are important questions to ask. And I think we're probably likely still going to have people within the church, good and godly men and women, who come to differing positions, even in those contexts. And so I feel like there's room, we need to continue to struggle through this so that we can see each other from both directions.
I think I've had conversations that are similar, like what we're talking about here, where can we disagree about something theological, but still love each other, be welcoming, be fully welcoming, related to that question we just had. And I think one big difference is a lot of the other things we disagree about with don't feel as personal, and they're not about, in some cases, like Shelley mentioned, making someone feel less than. Like if you believe something different about baptism or speaking in tongues or the person of Jesus or is hell real, like those are things we could really disagree on. But at the end of the day, you probably don't feel like, I don't know, like I view you less than if you believe something like that. It doesn't feel as personal. It's something you believe. It's not who you are. But you even mentioned in the book, Eric, identity is our youth need to know that their primary identity is not found in their sexuality or their gender, in what they've done or what's been done to them, but in whose they are. For any of you, what is your take on identity and the role it plays in all this? Because it does feel like it's much more important. It's hard to have a conversation, I think, around this topic without feeling it's really tied to someone's identity and who they are as maybe even the most important thing, if not the first or second most important thing in their life. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what do y'all think?
Nick Elio here. I think I say a lot. One of the things I think is helpful is folks are trying to navigate, what is different about the ministry that I need to do when it comes to LGBTQ teenagers. And one of the things that I like to do is level the playing field a little bit, and go, well, what would you do for straight 14-year-old Timmy when he says, like, how much of that is still going to be very similar into what you want to teach him, what you feel like he may need to say, what you want to communicate to him about his identity and his worth, and start there. And then, I think one of the ways that I talk about it in my chapter is there's no one answer for any of our kids. So hopefully we're contextualizing this all across the board, regardless of our kids' orientation or gender identity. And so from that place, I go, man, when it comes to my straight kids, when it comes to our non-LGBTQ students, I want them to also know that no romantic relationship is going to give them their sense of self-worth, no connection to some partner, no sense of masculinity or femininity or the way that their body looks. Like, that's not where you're getting your identity from. And so to act like our LGBTQ teenagers are the only ones that need to hear that, I think is missing it a bit. And I get how in our heads, it's like, man, like if that feels like the thing that we have to sort of correct or fix or whatever, like if our job as pastors and youth work is to point kids toward Jesus, and we almost, somebody just said this metaphor to me the other day, and I hadn't heard it. If we walk around with a hammer in our hand, everything is a nail. So if we're just looking for things we got to fix in the lives of our teenagers, that is going to make this feel like a very strangely identity centered component to the ministry that we either feel like we have to do or want to do in the lives of LGBTQ teenagers. But man, like at the heart of the ministry that I want to do and the message that I want for all of the teenagers that we get to interact with is none of your identity, again, relationship, orientation, decisions you've made about intimacy with other people, regardless of where you land in your orientation or your that's not the deal. The deal is beloved children of God. And if we start there, to Eric's point, then we're going to have, though we may color that differently and though we may have different theological positions, our LGBTQ teenagers are the only ones that need to hear that.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I 100% agree that we've got to start with reminding these youth that regardless of their sexual identity, their gender expression, any of that, that their identity first and foremost is as a child of God. I think that when you're talking about especially LGBTQ youth, they're exploring their identity in ways that might seem strange for some people, that might seem unnatural for some people. The reality is they're exploring their identities just as much as any non-LGBTQ youth is. But part of that identity is figuring out, who did God make me to be? And I think this is where it can be a bit of a tricky theological piece, because I'm sure there are people that would disagree with me. But first and foremost, like for instance, gender pronouns. So pronouns of what somebody wants to be identified as, or how they identify themselves and what they want you to use. That's really important, because that's them identifying who they understand themselves to be as God made them. So someone who is genderqueer might prefer to use gender neutral pronouns, them, they, their, and that is, for them, that is living into who the person that God made them to be. And that can be a hard thing for people to understand. But I think what we all do agree on is that, yes, you have got to be rooted in the understanding that first and foremost, no matter what, you are a child of God, you are beloved, you are created by God, good and perfect just as you are. And then from there, I think that's where our disagreements can start to stem, of saying, well, we're all children of God, but maybe little Nikki isn't living into that, or maybe Susie is not. She calls herself a transgender person, but she's not really. She's just confused. And I think that's where we can understand each other as children of God, but to really see each other as children of God that are different, and that difference is okay, instead of automatically placing a judgment on that. I think that's a hard thing for us as people and as practicing Christians in communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of the gender pronouns thing, Mark, one of the you said two of the questions you get. One is, I had a student come out, what should I do? The other one was, I have a transgender teenager who wants to come to summer camp. I don't know what to do there. But that whole section at the end of the book, you kind of acknowledge that most of the book is more the LGB conversation, and then at the end, a couple sections on transgender and queer. I thought was really helpful, from the pronouns to even your own experience in reading that. So I'd love to hear you tell us a little bit about that, Marco. How can we help leaders when they're going to have conversations, they're going to have students that are transgender or queer, and they're not so much the practical side of what to do at camp. They can get the book and read some of your helpful approaches there, but you just had a lot of wisdom to share in that conversation. I'd love you to share some of that, and the rest of you too, to jump in. I'd love to end with that if we could.
Well, thank you. That's kind of you. Let me just start by a couple preliminary comments. One, it's hard and messy. It's hard enough and messy enough when we're talking about our own perspectives on same-sex attracted or gay teenagers, and especially how do we reconcile that with what may or may not be an official posture of our church. Over and over again in the coaching program that the Youth Cartel runs, that's the issue. The youth worker actually is not in the same place as the stated position of the church. And there's a tension that if I actually follow what I believe God is asking me to do with these teenagers, I might get fired. At the end of the day, that's what a whole lot of youth workers are dealing with. But man, it gets exponentially more messy when we're talking about transgender and queer teenagers. Because the practical questions of what small group gender specific small group do I put them in? What about overnight trips? What about bathrooms? This is where the rubber meets the road, and it becomes really difficult. We have to come up with answers. It's one thing to come up with answers or an approach for how I can have a life-giving, co-walking a conversation with a teenager in the privacy of an office or a Starbucks or something. It's a whole nother thing when I have to make a decision that will become public about camp or whatever. I will say one of the things that became very clear to me leading up to the book, but crystallized for me in the development of the book is you can have some general guidelines that you develop, but the reality is every story is different. And as soon as you create a policy, you're going to create damage. That's because you're going to be confronted with a story and a situation that doesn't fit your policy. And so I think we have to acknowledge that every situation is really unique. I remember, I think I may have shared this in the book, I don't know, but I was working with just kind of casual consulting with a very large Southern California church. It was dealing with two questions of transgender kids. One was in middle school and one was in high school. In the situation with the high school kid, it was a legacy family who had been there since the foundation of the church. Their kid who was born a male was transitioning to female, and the parents had a million questions and were extremely supportive of the church walking alongside them. And they were saying, we know this is confusing. Let's all walk down this journey together. There was a desire to not be judgmental and to work together. And then in the middle school situation, it was a visitor. Was originally a visitor, but a kid who had started coming very regularly and was transitioning from female to male. And the mom, the single mom, was not a part of the church and was somewhat antagonistic toward the church. And it was just a completely different story. And if you had one policy for those, you would find that it didn't fit for the other one. And they did have to wrestle with, what do we do about camp? And what do we do about our single gender small groups in both of these situations? And what they found was their conclusion was different in each case, because of the uniquenesses of the stories. So I guess that would be a general guideline that I would give.
Yeah, that's good. And maybe to not feel bad that it's not a one size fits all. It's not a policy. Like even teach your people, hey, that's not what we're going for. We're going for what's the best thing for this student.
Yeah. And, and maybe another, just a general one that Shelley hinted at this earlier. I think it's really important to feel the freedom to say, I don't have all the answers. And to say that to the kid and say that to the parents, we don't have all the answers. Let's walk together on this. So often as youth workers or as ministry leaders, we feel like we have to have all the answers right out of the gate. And we get into this panic, this place of anxiety over not being sure how to proceed. That's okay. Acknowledge that and move slowly while continuing to give these words of love and affirmation and offering unconditional belonging.
That's great. I wish we had like hours to talk about this because there's not enough good conversation around this. There's a lot more, which is great. And this book is really helpful in that. There's just not a lot of resources surrounding these topics in ministry world in general, but certainly in youth ministry. How can people get a copy of the book, read it for themselves, what they obviously need to do?
Yeah, thanks. There's really only one place that you can get a physical copy of the book, and that's from the youthcartel.com. We no longer sell our physical books on Amazon because Amazon's deal with small publishers like us is just horrible. We were literally losing money on every single copy we sold. So the physical book from the youthcartel.com in our store, we do have a Kindle version of it on Amazon. So that's available there.
Great. Well, thank you all for writing the book, for coming on the podcast and talking about this, and for leading the way, I think, in many ways in these conversations. It's really, really helpful. If people want to connect with you, could they go to the Youth Cartel? And I know there's 4 of you, so there's 5 different ways, but if they have any questions or anything like that, how can they best do that?
Well, certainly that's how they could connect with me, Marco, is through the youthcartel.com.
Yeah, and our bios are in the book. You can reach me at ericdwoods.com.
Yep, I'm online as well, nickelio.com. You can Google, I assume, any one of our churches, just Google Denver Community Church. You can find my email there, that sort of deal.
And as well, I'm online. I blog at thetravelingtheologian.com and then on Twitter at ShelleyDT247 and email ShelleyDonaldson25@gmail.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to all that in the show notes so people can get that if they want and check out the book, which is, again, really helpful. Thank you for writing it and for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having us.
Well, I wish we had a lot more time to talk about it because we didn't get to everything I wanted to talk about. But fortunately, all of it is in the book, which is good. And I'm just thankful that they wrote that book because we need, like I said, more healthy conversations around this topic. We need more resources, more guidance, all of that. And this is one of the best books out there I've seen for student ministry leaders and even church leaders in general. So here's some action items I think of coming out of that conversation. One is obviously to get the book and to read it. I love that they bounce back and forth. I mentioned that one of them will writes a view and then another one responds to that view, which I thought was great, especially since they disagree on things. And then have necessary conversations. You're going to get the book hopefully and read it, but how are you going to apply this to your church and your ministry in a healthy way? So you need to have some conversations with leadership, maybe with volunteers, with other staff, with parents, whoever. And then another step would be to train your team. So, the focus of the book, of course, is how to pastor students. So and hopefully in your ministry, you're not the only pastor, you're training volunteers to be in the lives of kids and students. So how can you train them? How can you equip them? How do they respond? Because it may not be you that the student comes to first to talk to. So the stuff they shared at the end, I thought was really helpful with that. All of it I thought was great. So I hope you found it to be helpful. I hope that regardless of your theological position, you thought it was a good conversation and maybe gave you some handles and some resources and some things to think about. I pushed in a lot on even some of the, what we call it, maybe places where people disagree in the church, partially because I feel like those are the kinds of conversations that churches need to have, not just for student ministry, but across the board. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation. As usual, you can get all the show notes and links and things like that at nickblevins.com/episode 98. We'll link all their contact information and all of that there as well. So I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear from you if there was, questions you had or more help you would like around this topic or other resources that have been helpful to you. By all means, I always want to hear from you. So just email me at nick@nickblevins.com. But again, thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for leaving a rating and a review and things like that on iTunes. Coming up on 100 episodes here. The 2-year anniversary, I guess, is right around the corner, which we'll probably give away a bunch of stuff for that, which will be a lot of fun. So thank you for listening. I hope it's helpful. Until next time, have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.